Hello, Hugh. Long time no see.
Hello again. Let me just increase the size of this. There we are. Yeah.
Here we are, maybe like 2 days later, 3 days
Oh,
later from our last chat, and
yeah. I've got my...
we didn't really have the time to get through everything. So how about we just kind of pick up where we left off? How does that sound to you?
Yeah, that's good.
Great,
Yeah, I wanted to get more into the formative process that we started talking about, and we've been going around quite a few times now with respect to active orientation and how it pans out with Davidov and the whole setting of a problem situation that can act as a mold or a means of drawing together perspectives from the child or adult in a sense. We also, last session we talked about where I introduced the idea of epistemological forms, which is hopefully starting to maybe bring some ideas into play for you or help to clarify certain things. I think that the usefulness of this is, well, there's multiple facets of it, but hopefully it's clear to you that there isn't just categorically these 5 things. These are more helping to portray a landscape or certain kinds of knowledge and how it pans out with respect to development, cognitive development, and particularly its importance, like when we talked about mental tools and these other things, and how it's quite easy when you're considering all these other facets that Vygotsky talks about to forget about this epistemological side, which is very important, because that's really what all the developmental, in the terms of cognitive development, particularly in terms of thinking and the manipulation of signs, this is central to that. At least that's how I read it. Okay. So
before you continue, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I talk and think a lot about situations and situational awareness in my own teaching, because I kind of use a genre approach where the concept is every genre is in some sense like a situation that has typical features but also flexible features. And whenever you're participating in a certain genre, like this one, for example, the genre sort of shapes what's happening there to some extent, while the participants are also shaping it. So I just wanted to ask you if I had my mind in that place as we moved forward talking about situations and active orientation, would that be a productive mindset?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, add that to it's a helpful distinction I can make there too. I know you've got some questions that we're going to hopefully go through at the end. You can bring that back again, and we can talk about it.
Okay.
All right. So these epistemological forms that I'm referring to, you can think about these in a few useful different ways, which you conventionally you might think are different areas and not so closely related, but hopefully I'm going to show you that they are closely related. Okay, so first of all, I'd say they relate very closely to, as I covered 2 days ago, to a certain degree. They relate very closely to modes of reasoning or the kinds of logic that's used. So if you recall, I talked about Vygotsky talking about 3 different variants of reasoning and development of it, and I showed how this related to epistemological forms. Okay, right. We also said, okay, this is form of knowing. It entails generalization. Now, an important facet that I want to introduce here is also saying that these epistemological forms are representative of degrees of sophistication of using signs. Okay, I really want to just really slow down on this point here, and to think about this as much, you know, as much as you can entertain while thinking about everything else. Signs are very important for Vygotsky and pretty much any form of psychology, really, or even semiotics and other forms. Another way to think about signs is, and again here I'm talking about the personal construction and use of signs. I'm not talking about necessarily overt signs like you would find on roads or and such, saying, you know, stop, or, you know, 2 miles to the town and things like this. Of course, those are signs, but in the sense I'm using signs here, they are only signs in the sense I'm using when we treat them as signs, and we can treat anything as a sign. Okay. Peirce is very good for this. If you come into contact with Peirce, it can be confusing at first, but he's very clear on how pervasive signs are and their relationship to interpretation and action and other things. So, for example, well, if as you like to start videos sometimes and you count with your fingers, you know, this is a sign. You know, when you get to the 3rd finger, that's a sign to start, right? So this is a movement, and this movement is acting as a sign, just as anything else can. It could be a noise, it could be anything, literally anything within our perception can act as a sign for us, if we choose to use it that way.
Anything that's potentially interpretable, or just anything? Yeah,
well, anything that we can bring our awareness onto. Okay,
it becomes activated as a sign when our awareness.
We can choose to do so. I mean, of course, when we get to become adults, we're usually quite proficient in many of these facets, and so we don't necessarily we don't have to put much effort into making use of these hallmarks. And I'd say it's quite intuitive for many things, but you know, we become more sophisticated with them. Now, so I'm saying signs are, or the use of signs, like pointing, or you can use words, or all sorts of different features of signs, some of which work very well for communication, and others perhaps less so. Just looking and paying attention to something, right, is effectively you've got sign manipulation at play. So signs are like one side of the coin, of which the other one is awareness. Okay, and you can often treat the two together. All right, so experimentally you can be saying, well, I'm interested in signs, but you could say, well, at the same time, that's the same thing as certain kinds of awareness. Okay, or what you could talk about as being cognitive consciousness, the kind of consciousness that goes into cognitive work. Okay, and of course, signs are very important for all sorts of what we might call intellectual work. Okay, and to a large degree play a dominant role in that. Now, when we look at the development of different types of reasoning, hopefully you can start to see that the nature of the reasoning brings into play different configurations of sign manipulation. Okay, so if you have a kind of cause-effect nature of thinking, you might say, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. All right. And to some degree, that what this structure is helping is laying out is saying, I need to pay attention here, 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 and here. And I know there's a causal relation, and through my experience, I know I don't need to attend consciously to these points. All right. There are certain places I know where to look, where that's telling me I need to know where to look. So your reasoning is helping you in the manipulation of signs or awareness and telling you where to look or where to expect things, where to put your attention. Yeah. And that's one of the things that as a child, when you're learning and developing, is you have to figure out these things. Where do I have to put my attention in particular areas? What's important? So as your reasoning improves, the richness of where to put your attention can develop too. Okay. Some examples we could think of. Let's take sort of something action oriented to start with. Let's take something dramatic. If a bird flew in, if it was summertime and the windows open and a bird flew into the room here, okay, and the door's open, and I don't, the bird's getting very anxious, it's flapping around, making a lot of noise. I don't want the cat to get it or whatever else, and I don't, the bird's in a right panic, and it's going to knock things over, cause pandemonium, and it's probably going to bird poo all over the place and what have you. Okay, so I want to say, well, and it's moving around fast. Okay, so it's hard for me to just to get it.
Which happened in my house.
Yeah, it does happen
recently.
sometimes.
Yeah, very recently. It was funny. Okay.
All right, yeah, it does. It's quite dramatic. I know. Yeah. Now, I also know that. So this is one room of the house, and it's quite confined. So even though the bird is like moving around very fast and fluttering around all over the place, and I'm trying to get out the window, I don't want it to go out of my this room, out of the door and into the rest of the house and cause even more pandemonium. All right. So even though it's moving faster than I am, I know how to confine it. Right. And I can sort of, just like we were talking about chess the other day, right? I can sort of usher it out if I'm careful. Okay. Or there's certain place I know where to look and know where to expect this to move, and that is reasoning at play within this setting. Okay, so I want to make sure, well, first of all, if I'm not near the door, I want to make sure it can't get to the door and close it or whatever, and just so I can confine things. And I know I have expectancies of what's going to happen in this situation. And I think, if you think about it, a lot of mastery of situations is confidence with respect to expectations to some degree. Not always exactly what's going to happen, but this is where the epistemology can come into play, is in terms of saying you start to get an understanding of what knowledge is all about and its role in life, and you can start to get a confidence for a whole variety of situations, or even in situations in which you get thrown into them and you don't really have a clue to start with, but your knowledge about knowledge can help you in starting to structure things quite quickly. And so people will say, oh God, that chap's a fast learner, he's only been doing it for a day, and he's because you're tapping into something extra material that isn't, you're not, like I was saying 2 days ago, you're not completely reliant upon this new domain because you have this meta knowledge. So in some way, the epistemology is like metacognition in this respect.
That makes a lot of sense. And yet I'm still going to ask you to speak for another 45 seconds or so on that guy who's a fast learner.
Right. Okay.
What is it that he might be bringing to bear?
He just knows where to look, knows the relations between things, right? Has confidence with it too. knows he might, and it's not just intellectual knowledge. He can have, knows that emotionally he might be in an awkward situation, but he works with it, and he has confidence with these things. It's not just trickery, right? He's got genuine skills which enable him to have or her to have these confidence situations. Let's take another, rather than an action-oriented situation, let's take more of an intellectual position with respect to knowing where to look. I might be following an argument or a description that's given a mathematical treatment, okay? And I'm reading along and following it, but the person I'm reading this work, but the person's a mathematician, and I'm okay with the mathematics, but it's not my forte. I'm really not fine with it. And then all of a sudden he just makes this leap, and it's like he says, here we are in this situation, you have these little points, and because of this you have this, bang, something way out of my scope. So how did you get there, right? How does that relate? And it may be some sort of for me elaborate inductive process or something else, but for him it's just like looking at saying, well, the door's over there, it can only go out that way, right? It's the same thing, right? But just more of an intellectual space. Again, it's because of the nature of the reasoning at play. It's just saying, I don't need to bother out this stuff because I just know it's going to come out this end, right? Just because basically knowledge. And again, this, as we were talking about 2 days ago, when we're talking about differences between empirical and theoretical orientations, this is one of the things that the theoretical orientation can give you sometimes, is you can say through genuine experience and understanding of these things, you can say, well, I know this stuff is necessary empirically, but I also know that this is what I'm interested in, and this is going to be the outcome, and I know it's going to be showing up here. It's not always like that, but I think you can make a case for it as being, an important facet.
Yeah, that makes sense. And briefly, when you encounter that huge leap that you weren't expecting and that you're not really sure what it means, what moves do you personally make at that point?
Oh, so
because it's not that unrelated to my experience reading your paper, because I don't have the background.
Sure. I mean, you have to bear in mind
in the first section you cite about 15 names that I haven't read, and you're like to accurately critique this paper, right, you should be familiar with the following people. And I'm like, okay, I'm still going to read it, and maybe I'll get a chance to talk. Maybe I'll get a chance to talk one-on-one to get me a little closer. But so what might you do in that moment?
Well,
there's a big gap?
Again, you can use your own knowledge about this. I mean, again, you can say with your own with my own experience, that I say, well, I have confidence with certain things, and when I'm reading other authors, it doesn't have to be psychology; it could be something else, and I can just respect their coherence and the rigor they apply, and that for me, I just know from that, right, that they're highly unlikely just to enter into some waffly approach to something. Everything they're doing is going to have some rigor. So it's not like you can have complete faith in what that they're saying, what they're saying is gospel.
Yeah.
But you know that they've gone through a process.
You have a good vetting process yourself also.
Yeah. And you're just saying it's a discipline. I mean, it's like college level mathematics. Presume it's college level now, or it might be high school, where children are taught, or you come across induction, right? And induction in mathematics is a bit like that, because you're going from fairly close relations to things, and all of a sudden when you get into induction, you can go from, if you're talking about some inductive process, you can go from 0 to 1,000,000 in basically one inference, because you just know that there's this recursive or iterative process at play, and it's just a leap from relative to other processes. But that's just a skill to work with, and that's one of the good argument for keeping that sort of thing in the curriculum. But again, there's different ways to approach it, and
yeah, and I have the experience of like being in two minds simultaneously. Like when I hit a block in my understanding, so I'm like, okay, here I am at this block. I'm going to keep reading, and have faith that it's gonna untie itself. And if it doesn't, then I'm gonna go back to where I started. And maybe go back and maybe backpedal a few steps.
Well, it's an interesting, I mean, I'm not sure I consciously use this to a degree, but I do notice it as an interesting authoring style that you can use for engaging with things. And that's sort of, if you're introducing little puzzles or problems up front, then that in itself can gain engagement. I mean, it's the same principle at play when you have like whodunit novels and other mysteries and things, is that it's the not knowing aspect and wanting to know how something resolves. It can take you through, and you can find this in if even sometimes it comes across very naturally, because if you're, as an author, or if you're basically saying, if you're basically giving your own explorations as a kind of adventure story or something, because you're saying, well, there's this puzzle, and you're sort of working it out with the reader at the same time, even if it's retrospective. You can have this sort of engagement too. So you don't need answers to these things straight away. They can sometimes just, the puzzle, like with my explanation of Davidov, the problem itself can help you to focus. Right. And especially once you're getting beyond formal logic explanations, it's all about multiple connections between things. And so when you've got a problem, that's a great start to actually, because you're saying, not just how do I solve this problem, but you can start thinking about how does it relate to everything else. And now you talk about multiple facets, not just saying, oh, here's one category, here's another category, and maybe they have some causal relationship. Okay, to get a bit more subtle with it. Okay,
and sometimes maybe even going off to those outer connections can help you in the process of solving the main problem at hand. I had just a very quick comment, and then I wanted you to continue, because I did sort of rudely interrupt.
That's okay.
One of my favorite writers is James Wirch, and one of the things that I loved about him, because he was one of my first encounters with Vygotsky, and so he would write about 4 or 5 pages, which were complex for me at the time, and still somewhat are, and then he would basically recap what he just said, like habitually, all the way through. And I just love that writing style, because there's like a certain, I don't know, but it's almost kind. It's almost like cooperative in a way with his readers.
I really liked James Wirch as well, and he I think with some of the translations work he did, like for example, was a foundational book on this kind of psychology, which he called I think it was like the concept of activity or something like this, that he I think he did the translation work for, I think, or very instrumental anyway. But he also, his book on mind as action, I really enjoyed, and numerous papers. I think, but his interest in this area is, I think, well, I don't know what he's been writing or published more recently, but my take on it, on a lot of his writing, was that he had a particular set of interests, and he wasn't trying to embrace all of it and show how it all fits together. There's certain things, I think, where I was detecting, well, actually, I think he was getting certain things confused, but a large part of it, especially all the mediation aspects, I thought were great. you know, and there's some really nice analogies that he comes up with, like the pole vaulter and other things. I just
Mhm.
need to put the light on, and let me just take these off.
You got it.
Cloudy, overcast day, and yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
My
well,
favorite kind.
yeah, well, technically we're nearly in winter now, aren't we? So
Yeah, we had our first snow yesterday.
oh, okay.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
nice.
Right.
So I took you a little bit off track there, so
Okay.
you could pick up wherever you think is best.
Yeah. So I'm talking about facets of these epistemological forms, their relationship to different modes of reasoning, and how this pertains to personal knowing, generalization, use of signs, awareness, knowing where to look, and knowing about consequences. Okay, so logical corollaries and all the rest of it. Okay, and this all can be encapsulated by what you said, your personal epistemology, and you see how that relates to your logical reasoning. So even though you can use your logical reasoning in any skill, particularly mental skill, it's very closely related to how you understand the world too, right? Okay. All right. Now, the way this has a particular bearing within the system of formulated system that I use to look at activity. Is closely related. Well, when I was putting it together, for me, it was just like saying, well, this is mostly activity theory, but there's other aspects that I'm bringing in, and there's Vygotskian aspects you can relate to, and you know, I'm confident in arguing a case of showing the continuity between activity theory and cultural historical theory of Vygotsky. Okay, you just have to read between the lines quite a bit. But anyway, we won't go into that too much here. Okay. So I'm going to talk about signs, okay, and their use, and I also needs to introduce some elementary ingredients and how they come together with respect to actions. Okay. So an action is basically our process of doing something to achieve a goal, a simple goal. Okay. And I treat it in a very similar way to Leontief treats it. Okay. But I'm saying, well, actions generally consist of movement, okay, and thinking. But the thinking can be largely expressed or made manifest through the use of signs. Okay. Now, actions, in the way that I'm using them and Leontief uses them, pertain to personal processes undertaken with cognitive conscious control. Okay. And this means generally, just in the way our makeup is, I mean, I'm generalizing a little bit, and I can go into some exceptions to this once I've gone through the set of relations a few times.
Is this as opposed to reactions? Is that one way to distinguish?
Well, no, they're actually, I can come to that. Actually,
Okay, I'll hold on.
this is a very, it's a very important, it's an important or an interesting point. Okay, so actions, generally talking about movement and use of signs. Okay, now I can control my movement and be conscious of it, or I can make a movement effectively without needing to pay conscious attention. I can pick up this mug and be talking at the same time. Okay, now this is achieved because I've, you know, as a very young child, you start to learn these things, and you can, our makeup is such that certain things that require conscious attention can be taken over to a certain degree and be undertaken automatically, okay, with a certain degree. Now, a better word to use than automatic in many of these situations, I would say, is autonomic. And again, this is where some precision helps, because in my use of the word autonomic, what I'm referring to is the opportunity to take conscious control over something. So even though I have operations that I can just do things, I don't have to pay hardly any attention to them. It's just a matter of wanting this to happen. If I so choose, I can override this automatic process, okay, and make conscious attention of it, okay. And this is just one of the wonderful things about our makeup, how you know, our architecture, if you like.
Yeah, and my sense is that that word is going to become very important soon in this conversation.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. So
just the idea of choosing, to attend and take conscious control over heretofore automated processes.
Okay.
Is
all right.
Well,
it's a key. Okay. So why this is important, okay, is that again, things that we choose to have conscious control over are generally quite limited and usually take place only serially or sequentially. So we can generally, and again, there are exceptions to this, but generally, if we're putting conscious attention into things, it's about doing one action at a time, okay? And it's done slowly relative to how operations work. It's done slowly. So often if we're learning something new, let's say we're playing some racket sport like tennis or squash, and we're new to it, and we're trying to learn how to do a backhand stroke, all right, which typically might be harder than the forehand, might be okay. In the backhand, you start off all over the place, and you have to put attention into it, yeah, to get it right. This is going to start off quite slow, and you just keep working at it, paying attention to what's happening, what you're doing. So yeah, I'm coming back to saying that actions, if the conscious actions are generally serial, okay, you can only generally do one at a time, all right? So if you are playing tennis and you're learning to do this backhand stroke, you might find it difficult to concentrate on doing the backhand stroke whilst talking about something at the same time. Or I recall, you know, when learning to drive a car, for example, you know, when you're consciously attending to what's going on, you don't necessarily want other things interfering. So even for, like, I don't know, for like the first year probably when I was driving, because I wasn't driving every day for the first, you know, you need lots of experience. And I think I would deliberately have the radio off because I didn't want the distraction, okay? Because you're consciously attending to things. Now,
I was trying to make a custard for the first time last night, and my wife asked me. She's like, "What's the name of the guy who plays James Bond?" Those are some of my favorite movies. and I couldn't think of his name. I was so
Yeah,
focused
yeah, yeah.
on tempering the eggs the right way. I
Oh
just simply
gosh.
couldn't manage
Yeah,
the basic conversation,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm guilty of that. Uh, Even when I'm not doing something new, that it's often
yeah,
I'm thinking about something or I'm
yeah.
planning
Well,
something and I can't even attend to the thing that's right
well,
in front
well,
of my face.
well, sometimes that lack of recall is contextual as well. It's just you're in a different context, perhaps. You know, I mean, I have that all the time. Interesting point to make of that, actually. Maybe as you could add that to your long list of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure we'll get to it, but
Yeah.
you never know. All right. So that's the conscious side. I'm saying it's quite serial. Now, the operations, which are special actions, if you like, don't require conscious attention. All right. And within the limits of the resources you have available to you, you can generally do lots of different operations at the same time. All right. Now, anyone familiar with Leontief also says, okay, that says, oh well, an action is made up of or composed of operations, right? So you can say, well, a wall is made up of bricks, okay, and you can say an action is made up of operations. Okay, you can do that, and you say now that where the role of signs in this comes in, and where I'm talking about signs, I'm particularly talking about external signs, is that the signs are the means of coordinating different operations. Okay. So you can have certain operations that will just do their thing and you don't have to attend to them. But if you're going to coordinate them via something that's external and moves around or is variable, right, then there is a part of your conscious attention that needs to take place in this. If you have a jug of water and you're pouring the water into a mug or something, you're pouring yourself a glass of water, okay, this movement, fine, this movement, fine, but bringing them together so you don't spill the water, and you probably have to pay attention to what you're doing, okay? Mm-hmm. So there's many operations which can happen on their own, need a kind of glue, okay, to bring them together. Now, although we're saying, okay, so now we've got this analogy between bricks and concrete and a wall, okay, where the wall is like action and the bricks are the operations and the concrete is like signs. That analogy only works so far, all right? And you might say that analogy is typical of the kind of thinking that might go into like formal logic where you want separate things, all right? Because now we can say, well, actually the actions can turn into operations, okay? I'm going to give you an example now. If we let's take a different domain. Let's say for unusual reasons, I want to learn a certain dance routine or something, okay? And it's quite elaborate, and or maybe it involves moving my arm in a particular way or something, okay? And to get it right, I think I can adopt certain signs and say, oh, it's got to go here, and I've got to have my elbow like that, and then bring it, or whatever. There's certain things I need, and I can just, because you want to get it right, and the rhythm and coordination and the rest. Now I can adopt and use certain signs for this, and like I'm saying the signs coordinate certain unconscious movements or operations, okay? But once I become familiar with this set of moves, okay, I can find that I don't need to pay attention to these signs, or you can think about it as external signs. I don't need to pay attention because there's other other signs or indicators within my body that I can use proprioception, my sense of the body itself. And once I've got a feel for it, like sensorial proprioceptive feel, I know it's right. Just like I can put my hand behind the back and do something. I can't see it, but I just know that it's working right. So there's other resources that I have available to me. Now, these internal signs are not really contingent upon anything else changing. Okay, it's not like with the jug of water and the glass. It's not. It could be different heights. Yeah, my steadiness might be different. I might be on a train and it's wobbling around and all sorts. Okay, but a kind of movement where everything is integral, everything is under my own personal control. Okay, that those signs that become used, right, can detach themselves from necessity for my conscious awareness of them. Okay, so if I have a set of what start off as conscious actions that are not contingent upon external signs, or where alternative signs can be adopted that are internal, then these use of these external signs can basically wither away and just leave a residue of internal use signs.
Mm-hmm.
And through the process of improving these actions, can turn into an unconscious operation and be conducted very, very efficiently and very quickly. That isn't going to put undue load on my conscious attention. Mm-hmm. So I can be attending to other things. So once you're really enjoying something, you can, once you know it, you can be paying attention to other details. So in that situation, we have an example of where a set of actions can be completely transformed into operations. Okay. We also have sort of a middle ground, interesting middle ground, where you can have actions which to a large degree can all be completely taken over by internal used signs, but there still might be a residue of external signs that are necessary. Again, we can sort of use the body movements as an analogy. If you were, let's say you were doing, I don't know, pull-ups or something, and you want to jump up to the bar and then start whatever chin-ups or something you're doing. There are certain parts of that which can all be internalized, but I'd suggest that the business of catching hold of the bar is quite an important one. And that's, again, you've got certain parts of the process that are always going to be external reference points within this flow of movement. The same situation can apply to what Vygotsky talks about in terms of the particular term is escaping me now. Where he's talking about inner speech or internalized speech. I forget the particular. What's the phrase he uses?
Not internalization.
Yeah, it's a particular term he uses for speech. I'm sorry, it's slipped my mind a particular line. But anyway, the whole point is that you can start when you've got this inner speech starting to take place. It's almost like you can, if you're the kind of person who likes thinking with words quite a lot, you don't need to repeat the whole word to yourself, right? It could just be little bits of the word.
Yeah,
right?
It's not abbreviation, but it's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is that withering away of the unnecessary aspects. So you can end up just having just the bare essential signs that are necessary for this undertaking.
Almost a sense, which is like it's almost like you could imagine a thing that's almost completely withered away, ghost-like, but there's still a sense of it there, which is enough.
Yeah, or just whatever the bit that's actually used,
Mm-hmm.
the necessary part that's used. And the rest of it, there can still be signs at play, but they're different to the original configuration of signs. So signs you can think of in this perspective, like you could think of them another analogy. You could think of them like the knots in a net, like in a fishing net. All right, and or how to basically delineate something. I'm always talking about drawing lines around things, and that's where you could be doing this in practice in terms of how you construe an object. What's the important part? What part of the mug do you reach for when you're picking it up? All these points where you have attention at play, the signs are implicated. But
very, very quickly, did you ever see that passage? It's pretty famous on the internet, where it's about a paragraph long and every word is jumbled, but the first and last letter of each word is in its proper place.
Okay.
And it's super easy to read.
Yeah.
Is this another sort of analogy that we might use here?
To a certain extent, yeah, I think so. Yeah, because again, there's critical parts of the words that are indicative to us. I mean, the other thing, there's other clues in the sentence. We're expecting a grammatical construct.
Yeah.
And we expect the nouns and verbs to be in particular places and that sort of thing. But yes, particularly with respect to just key parts, structurally important parts of words or other features that we might rely upon.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how much we could understand without like fully processing every bit of it.
Yeah. And hopefully you can see how this relates to what I was talking about a bit earlier when I was saying about knowing where to look.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So far I've introduced.
Is knowing where to look always learned, or is that a sort of human nature innate thing, like the body knows, like that kind of concept? Or is that a topic for another time?
Well, some of the interesting questions come from, you can go back in time to a certain degree, and then you think, well, you always ask the question, well, where did that come from, and where did that, so probably a question for another time. Yeah. Okay. So I was saying I've introduced operations, actions, signs. I've talked about movement. Okay. And I've related so now you can more clearly sort of associate operations with movement to a large degree. I'm suggesting you can associate signs with thinking to a large degree. Not fully. Okay. Now, big piece that we haven't put into context here is what I'm calling active orientation, and the role of active orientation in expressing intention or the task at hand or the object of activity. To a certain degree, these can be treated synonymous in this particular context. Okay. Now, in the same way that actions can become operations, and vice versa, an operation can become an action when we choose to pay attention to it, because they're autonomic. Well, they're not all autonomic. There's some things we can't pay attention to and check and control. Okay, depends how we learn, how we construct these operations. For example, there's some areas like I have certain techniques that I don't have full control over, and but if I relearned them in a different way, then I probably would. But it's not an important feature for me. But the active orientation or the object of activity can itself transpose into actions, and likewise actions can become something bigger. I don't really see that as such a strong interplay as the actions and operations, but that just might be because it's an area of my focus is on some of the more detailed aspects of the kind of things I've been looking at. Now, you asked a question about, well, you brought up a difference, saying, well, what's the difference between actions and reactions? Yeah. And within this system, one thing that I haven't brought into play yet is the role of emotion. Okay. And I would like to suggest that in this system, of that when one is constructively and doing things in an active sense of working with objects and trying to achieve goals, and you have intentions, is that the natural role of emotion is in regulating actions. Okay. Now, by regulation, I mean sort of molding and shaping actions, particularly, and reactions too. So when we have an intention to do something, we might formulate a strategy, okay? And that strategy is going to comprise of many actions. Now, this may or may not go to plan. And if it doesn't go to plan, there may well be, it depends on the nature of the situation we're in, but we can quite easily find emotions coming into play because the emotions themselves can function as a means of marshalling resources. They're a kind of resource, an energization, if you like, and if the actions aren't going the way we want them to go, then emotions can start coming into play and actually help to mold or construct new actions. And you can think of these, particularly when emotion is at play, as a reaction. You are reacting to this effectively. Although you consciously have an intention, you can react to that intention not going the way you wanted it to. All right. Maybe you can relate this to your own experiences. I find with a lot of these things, although because it sounds like there's lots of things I'm introducing, if you try and relate this to your own experience, and hopefully you find that it maps on fairly accurately. Okay. So now I'm not saying that's the only role of emotion, but within this activity system, that's, I would say, a predominant role for it. Of course, if you're in the throes of emotion and it's very quite strong emotion, that's going to affect everything. Like you might be agitated, and it's going to affect your movements. Might even affect you, that you can't think straight, and everything can get disrupted. But other kinds of emotion, it's more like just a kind of uprising, and you're like, I need to alter course.
Yeah.
Okay? Which in itself can redirect your conscious attention and say, so that's like a formulation of reactions.
Yeah, I have a appreciation for what you're saying, because I have sometimes a natural bias toward thinking of the word emotion in maybe a more negative sense than.
Okay.
But I mean, I use my emotions positively, but I'm not consciously thinking of them as emotions.
Right.
Let me say it this way: like I like the Stephen Covey formulation of this is like his first habit out of 7, which is essentially to be proactive is to try to live in the space between stimulus and response. Try to stretch that space out, where
Sure.
before responding like willy-nilly, like try to process your options. And that is a very emotional space right there.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a sense of where you want to go, that can shape your decision making, because whenever you could recognize that you're in a moment, you're in a reactive moment, you have choices. Um,
Yeah,
you could slow down time, so to speak.
absolutely.
So everything you're saying is sort of bringing my attention there, but
Okay.
you're bringing a positive spin to it that was a little bit lacking.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to. I mean, well, one distinction you probably need to make is between emotion and feeling. And feeling is kind of more of a refined. You know, if you're reading a piece of nice literature,
Mm.
the whole point is probably to evoke some feelings and sense of it. But that's more refined, I would say. It's not like the raw emotion of things. It's more cultivated.
Mm.
And of course, you know, just as certain people have preferences for thinking, there are many people who conduct a lot of their reasoning or cognitive work emotionally. And I'd suggest it's the feeling nature that they're accessing. And that can be sort of, so rather than thinking about strategy necessarily, there's more like, how do I maneuver through a situation, or what kind of, what do I value, and how can those values be harmonized? So you can foreground either of them, but
Yeah.
generally I think you find that often people have preferences one way or the other, and it's a skill to bring both into play. I think to have.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You often have people like, you know, headstrong thinking people who don't necessarily have that subtle control of an emotion. It can easily, once they get caught up in it, then that can funnel their attention in particular ways, which, you know, they might subsequently regret. But the same thing can happen in people who have fine control of the nuances of feeling, enable them to perhaps control their emotions somewhat. But I think emotions are notoriously difficult to control. But they're not so exercised in the thinking capacity. So all of this can feed into, once you start digging more into psychology and you've read around quite a lot and done your own thinking, it's like me, you could start to integrate all these points. And I think that's part of the, well, for me, it's always been part of the interest.
Interesting. And we probably have maybe less than 30 minutes.
Okay.
But I'm still going to ask a quick question. Is this concept of getting caught up in the moment or in the emotions, is that an indication of shoddy active orientation?
Oh. Well, I'm not sure there is such a thing as shoddy active orientation. I mean, you could say one is always, in my sense, if you're working with things, you always have an orientation. Like your psychology is somewhere. You're attending to particular things, so it's something that's always manifest. But if you're thinking about the active orientation in the sense of awareness of how I'm oriented, then yes, it's going to be somewhat restricted. I mean, an interesting relation I make or think about is that if you, for lack of a better phrase, if you're able to hold your orientation or intentionality with some degree of plasticity, all right? So although you know, if you're in a situation where, you know, which is delicate, for example, if you come into this situation and you just say, no, this thing needs to be done, and you're just focused on, that's your intention, okay? Now, you're setting yourself up for a little fall here, because you're basically hardwiring your emotions to kick in particular times, which might not be conducive to the situation. Because, at least as my understanding, most of us don't really have conscious control or easily control emotions, particularly when they're actually manifest. But one way you can control your emotions is by recognizing, and particularly in this role that I'm talking about in terms of regulating actions, is recognizing that emotions are effectively mediating between your intention and the actions. And your intention, if you have awareness, should be under your conscious control. or maybe under your conscious control. Well, for adults, I'm not talking about for young children, right? So by attenuating your intention, you can control your emotion, right? So if you suddenly say, oh, I'm not gonna, this thing isn't so important to me now, literally actually redirect your intention. If you can do that, then you have control over your emotions to a large degree. I mean, maybe it's not going to work out all the time. You're still going to get tripped up. But
it's possible. Yeah, it's probably possible to do that so frequently and so often that it becomes in itself autonomic to some extent.
Yeah. Well, Leontief makes this point a little bit, but I think you can go beyond Leontief and actually, to a certain degree, you can see how operations, actions, and this third level, which I'm mostly referring to as active orientation, but you could say the object of activity, they can be formed from each other. All right. So I wouldn't say it's not necessarily accurate to think of them as just three separate units, and one is built out of the other, okay? Because generally we're starting off with actions, and you can build from them. So it's perfectly permissible to think about this, I think, in a recursive or composite fashion. Just the ways language and other forms of expression, other uses of, in mathematics and programming and all sorts of different things, you can have a recursive structure. Even action, even movement. I've seen, formulations about systems of movement which can likewise be recursive, and certainly that can apply to Leontief, and to activity theory and the way I construe it, yeah. So I've only gone around this once. Probably, as I said, the signs part probably is the important point. And my treatment of signs, I would say, well, at least in my impression, is very similar to the way that Luria and Vygotsky treat them, and in people, that I have read under the umbrella of activity theory treat them. And I use them in my study in order to, because if you by looking at the configuration of signs at play, you can discern strategy, and from strategy you can discern orientation. And these are very important points in the experimental work that I was producing. And in this work, you can also see what's called, like what I'm referring to as morphogenesis of these processes. So you can see how something starts off as an action. So in my work, I'm looking at the formation of letters, drawing, and you can see how a child starts off. I'm just going to do it from my perspective, so it's be backwards for you. It might start off with an A, like we would just draw an A like this, but even given guidance, they're going to be a bit shaky and stop and start and what have you, and slowly come to be more fluent. Okay. And there are distinctions you can make in this fluency with respect to operations. So a nice term that one practical-oriented activity theorist, he's deceased now, unfortunately. I think his Christian name is Gregory, and his surname is Bedney. And he wrote some books that were useful for me because they're quite practical, technically oriented. They weren't developmental books, but they were looking at how to study movements and things like this, and relate them to activity theory, or his variant of activity theory. You can use clues like pauses as indicators of thinking processes. I think I was referring to this before in one of our earlier conversations. And through studying this, in my case, using a computer to record the process of movement, because it's all done with, it's all touchpad sort of stuff, so you can record all the movements. You can see how the morphology of these movements can change over time. You can see how where the signs crop up moves over time. And so you can see the transformation of actions into operations, if you like. Okay. But not only that, you can see how signs are being used. So in my experimental work, I reuse some of Galperin's framework for this, because he looked at handwriting. But I've got a different intention, because I'm looking at can I discern the active orientation itself rather than the focus that Galperin had. So I'm using a lot of these. So I use some of Galperin's framework and look at how you can have basically two activities. Okay, one activity is a planning stage, another activity is an execution stage, and look at whether the two relate to each other. So as a young child, start off showing them and saying basically not even worrying about this first activity. You give them this letter to draw, and you're already providing a lot of guidance. So I start off by providing basically a corridor within which they need to draw. Okay, so there's only a few things they need to bear in mind, and that's the where you start and where you end and the direction you go, and everything else basically says you have to stay within that corridor to complete the letter. That's like first stage. This, by the way, is addressing some of your questions about how do I bring active orientation into play. Okay, so this is an indication, because I'm working here with a very young child. He's only very, very young 4-year-old. Okay, so that's starting position. Next position, let's take the corridor and let's just put we also have some dots in it. Okay, now at this stage, he could just ignore those dots, those guiding marks, and just still do the movement, right? The corridor, right? But he so chose that he was going to pay attention to them. And when I introduced them, I said, well, these are some extra guidance, right? You might pay attention to. And so noticeably, in my processing of the data, I could see that, and also just being able to watch while he was doing it, I could see that these marker points are starting to be used, signs. Okay. Once he gets quite a good proficiency with that, I can say, right, now we're taking the next step. Okay, now we're going to remove that corridor and just have those signs at play. All right, so now he has to do dot to dot and go around, but he has to remember where to start. There's other things he has to remember. Okay, because he could easily, with an A, if there's a particular configuration of dots, right, he might. And the beginning of the A is here, so he starts here and then goes round. Say, for example, he might easily confuse it, and it'd take this point or this point is the beginning of the A, and therefore he ends up with an A like something like that or something. So he has to remember other aspects. He hasn't got all the information there. This is just extra guiding information. It's not telling him everything. He still has to have some sort of residue impressions about what he has to do. Now, when he gets good at using those dots to make that letter, we can now move on to a second stage of saying, okay, originally I gave you those dots. Now we're going to have a first stage activity. You're going to choose where to put the dots, or well, not first stage actually, because he's so young age. You want to try and avoid you've really been really, really careful here. Right, so saying, well, those were the dots where we had them. Now you have to put the dots in, but I'm showing you where to put them. So he has to go in this way. He says, oh, one there, one there, one there, one there, one there. And if he gets them right, then we move on to the next stage. Okay, and now he draws the letter. You follow me? So now, although there isn't a hell of a lot for him to do in this first stage, he still has to get it right. Okay. So he's got first stage activity, second stage activity. Once he gets happy with that, move on to the next stage. Now we say, okay, here's the letter. So it's drawn on. He can see the A, right? choose your own points. All right. You choose where you're going to put your guiding points here. So he puts the guiding points on and then moves on to the activity of actually drawing the letter. But now his guiding points come up, not the original ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you can start to look at and say, well, is he using the results of that first activity in this second activity? All right. Because there's a kind of communication that needs to take place. Okay. And with the young children, it's probably not going to happen because they can't do this planning business. All right.
Mm-hmm.
But in the study that I was doing, I started to show that how it was my child who I was working with, just convenience and ethics and everything else. It just say, well, okay, just do. How I captured in the studies the neoformations, if you like, the new capabilities of starting to use this planning activity in the actual activity itself. Okay. And this is starting to show this thinking about what you were doing aspect. Okay. But again, it's like, these signs represent where to put your awareness. And again, he could easily get this slightly wrong. All right. So there's stuff, but all this stuff he's having to do himself. He's have to think, well, what does this mean for him?
Starting to take over. He's starting to take over these things.
Yeah. But now, so in this sense, I've managed to slowly guide this process where originally I was given basically all the guidance. And then bit by bit, I just slowly, giving more over to his control. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, is that he would do multiple letters. So although he becomes very familiar with letters like A, B, C, D, E, he actually doesn't go that way because they start off with, in primary school, at least here, there's a particular sequence of letters that go through. They don't go from A to Z. They start with S, and there's a
curves.
It's particular sequence. So although he might become familiar with certain letters, there's others that he won't be. So you can always test out to see whether he has a generalized ability coming into play. But that's the kind of method. So you're looking at the use of signs, what they imply about strategy. You can see whether he's actually using them effectively. Okay. And so this really nitty-gritty kind of really low level, right, stuff where you're measuring microseconds. You're saying what counts as a slowing down, what counts as speeding up, whether something is deviated or not, whether it's a ballistic movement.
And the microseconds indicate what sorts of things?
Well, if something slows down, it's indicating paying attention, close attention. So you're either trying to regulate the movement and get it right, or you're not sure, or you're thinking about other things. It's basically you're saying, well, you can effectively say, as a shortcut, you think of it as a sign. All right. Now, you could easily, if you had more apparatus and more time and more resources, you could easily bring more things in, particularly with technology we have now. So in a lot of cognitive work, people are using eye tracking devices and this sorts of thing. So I could easily expand on what I've done and use eye tracking devices to actually demonstrate that one is that there's a correlation. But already within the experimental data and the references that I make to Bedney and others, there's good reason that you can use timing information to be highly suggestive that there's other thinking processes at work.
Very interesting. If as a consequence of doing this fine-grained level of observation and work and the understandings that you have reached as a result, can you move any of that into other domains where you're trying to teach the same person or even yourself? Or
First of all, it's just demonstrating the coherence of the whole thing, right? So even though we could be talking very high level things where we're not getting down into these details.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah.
But we are a large part of our life is our bodies, and how we they play an integral role into things, and operations and actions and signs are, I would suggest, that's a good system. I mean, there might be other ways to construe all this, okay, coherently, but in my experience of my reading around, this is a good formulation, okay, to bring it together. Now, in terms of what I wanted to set out to talk about in this second part, that's pretty much it. I mean, the rest of it, I think, is just elaboration and showing its relevance and significance of it. Yeah. I think that at least for some people in this area, that the novelty that I'm bringing forward, or at least highlighting for them, might be, first of all, this notion of epistemological forms, really making it very clear that development is very much about this, not just importing culture, all right? But there's personal development of understanding going on. And then showing that this entails the sophisticated or degrees of sophistication in the use of signs. So there's really, very fine details, right, that do play a very strong part in the larger scale side of things. Okay, it's not that it would be inaccurate to treat all this in terms of saying, oh, we don't need to worry about the little blocks, all right, or the little things. We can just focus on the bigger stuff. You really wouldn't have the subtleties to hand to because I think you can do a lot with it.
Is it possible to do? That's great. Is it possible to structure an experiment similar to the one you did with the letters, but with say 8th graders doing a writing task?
Yeah, sure. You might have to think a little bit, because if it's all
I was just wondering the degree to which it would map on to like a higher level, or a higher level activity.
Well,
or maybe I shouldn't say higher level, because at 4, that's as high level as a writing task is at age 13.
Rather than speculate too much, I mean, I can come up pretty quick fire areas which would be interesting to look at. For example, you can look at effectiveness in reading and using eye tracking and that sort of thing, okay, as indicators, and how much toing and froing is going on, okay, that sort of thing. I reckon you could probably dig into the mode of reasoning and the kind of associations at play, and the nature of the signs. Where you'd have to think a bit differently, of course, is because words they're presenting us a certain level of abstraction or a platform about activity to a certain degree, because we have this abstracted the word meanings referring to undertakings, and so there's this linear aspect to the words. But there might be an interest. You could look at probably very interesting things about, for example, relationships between the way the words are used and the way people actually undertake activities as well. Could be quite interesting. In a different domain, I can think about other things in a different domain with, for example, in mathematics, which I've actually read papers about. It ties in quite closely with other researchers. Some I've talked to a little bit who've done work on what they call anchoring, and they were looking at, for example, how children's comprehension of, say, graphs okay, or the use of graphs was dependent on their their sign usage to a certain degree. Okay. Now, in my thinking about this, I was saying, well, I think you could probably take it a step further and say that until these operations were fully manifest and formed, then they probably couldn't start to employ reflexive skills on it. So the noticing of the signs, knowing where to look again. Okay, what they would call anchoring is basically knowing where to look and how to extrapolate the right information from a graph. You could probably apply that to literature as well. I would just have to think about it for a while. Yeah.
Interesting. I love the idea of the corridor and then the dotted line and then the points,
yeah,
and all of those things sort of slowly fading away, because that's a fair amount of my teaching is sort of doing that, but in a different way.
Yeah. So if you, I'm fairly sure that if you gave me indicators of what kind of guidance you give at a really, starting from very close guidance to more looser forms of guidance, probably think up some sort of system out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I have a couple minutes, and then I have to go teach.
Yep. Okay.
But I want to just give you a couple questions real quick. That if any of them are quick to answer, give it a shot. And I'll start from hardest to easiest.
Okay.
So the first one is, and I put it in the chat if you wanted to read it as well. I said, how might one teach or introduce the concept of active orientation? Maybe even introducing it in a Davidovian way. That was question one.
A good way would be, if you had the time, is in a sort of memory exercise, I think. You can say, trying to do a similar activity in different ways and demonstrate how powerful it is. Yeah. And there's papers I can show you on this. Some very good papers that basically showing effectively that the structure, it's showing the relationship between the structure of activity and the structure of memory that you get from it. Okay, you could almost think that it's like an imprint. All right, if you almost the impressions will come at you. So if you the degree, not only degree of engagement, but the structure, the way you think about a problem, your memory is already forming in that process. It's not like your memory is. This is one of the issues I have with Vygotsky. Is it's not like your memory is a separate unit that you plug in at certain points. Right. Your memory is available on all facets, and you're forming it in the process. So it's natural that your memory of activity, of what you're doing, is going to reflect exactly how you did it. So if you're doing it in a very rich way, you're going to have very rich memory of it, and it's going to help your recording. Okay, that's one way in.
Makes sense. Question two is, I know the answer to the first part, but is active orientation a good or important concept for teachers to know about, and what makes you say so?
Yes. Because their development is very important. Development of children, I would say, is very important. One interesting, well, it's interesting, it could be alarming depending on your perspective, but you see that this kind of development doesn't necessarily happen of its own. The child themselves has to take them through it. The agent themselves has to take them through it. But also that once if you start thinking about this space, you can see how if you get consolidated in one way of reasoning and you just stick with that, it can be very hard to actually try to break out of that system. All right. These different degrees of these epistemological steps you could think of to a certain degree, like the different shells that a hermit crab can go through, right? And they are discrete to a certain degree. They're not necessarily they're not like completely contiguous. there are, I think structurally, there are discrete steps, just like Vygotsky talks about the necessity for personal revolutions. You have to basically consume the old way of doing things and lay a new foundation, okay, which is part of this reorganization. And that can take work, but if you become too cozy in your way of doing things, it can be hard to get out of this. And this is one interpretation. You can look at, say, personality and psychological development among adults, is that, you know, they develop on certain features, and other ones they're just happy where they are. So there is personal responsibility, but you don't want to overly, you know, it's a shame that schooling is so empirically focused, where it doesn't facilitate this personal adventure, this of understanding, which is the exercise that's actually necessary to achieve this reorganization.
Interesting. I love the word adventure there too. And I have one more question, maybe too.
Okay.
In 30 seconds or less, what has active orientation allowed you to unlock, or at least to see more clearly?
Well, it's big. It's as I say, for me, it's interconnected ideas in lots of different ways, and it's a fulcrum for many facets, including new things that I'm coming across. So it's a great bridging point. As I say, it's a problem that I've been working with for probably 20 years, you know, in the background. All my draft papers touch upon it now, pretty much right now. I wasn't so conscious of that before, that I was just thinking, oh, these are different areas, but actually they all touch upon it. And yeah, it seems to be, that's my, you know, it seems to be, you know, if I've got a research topic, then that's what it's been. Yeah. So.
And then my final question, and thank you again. It's really good to see you. In 20 seconds or less, what does it mean to get smarter?
Well, different kinds of smartness, you know. Diego Maradona is pretty smart about some things, right? You know, so, but in my sense, I'm talking about this epistemology, and that's sort of cognitive smart. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Knowing where to look, etc.
Sounds good.
Okay.
We'll keep in touch.
Yeah. You want to come back with more, then, you know, but
yeah,
I feel,
I have more, but
yeah, I feel satisfied that at least I've got this out. You know, I know we haven't spent much time on it, but at least I'm saying, look, it's not just active orientation. There's the whole system behind it. Okay.
Right.
You know, you could talk about active orientation in terms of this mesh and network of signs, and say this whole configuration is expressive of a particular orientation. There's work in different ways.
Yeah, and I have to say, I would recommend this project that I'm doing to anybody with his or her own interests, because it's very cool to you know, talk to the people that you're wanting to learn from, and then to record it, and then to have access to all of it, and then to actually put labels on everything that was talked about.
Okay.
Like when I'm labeling the videos, it's a very interesting process. That's a big part of my learning.
This is part of your signs, you know.
Yeah, totally.
There's that constellation of different things.
And then like now this 5-minute segment is now something I could sort of put in my pocket, you know, put it away, pull it out whenever I need to. Yeah. So, it's cool. Okay, I got to get to work. So good to see you, and yeah, we'll keep in touch. Cool. Thanks again.
Okay.
Hope you enjoyed. All right.
Right ahead. Bye bye.
Cool. Ciao.